Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here with Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, February 1st, 2024. Professor John Mearsheimer, University of Chicago, joins us now. Professor Mearsheimer, always a pleasure, sir. Welcome back to the show, and thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
I want to spend most of our time on the latest events in Israel and the corresponding events in the United States involving the president. But before we do, just a couple of questions, if you wouldn't mind, on Ukraine. Within the past 24 hours, the EU has announced 50 billion euros, 54 billion US dollars approximately, in aid to Ukraine. That, of course, required twisting the arm of President Viktor Orban of Hungary, and apparently they did twist his arm in a rather ugly way. So I'm wondering if you can weigh in on this. How did they get Orban to go along? And what is Ukraine, which is about to lose its chief military guy and which is in desperate need of manpower, going to do with $50 billion worth of second-rate military equipment?
A couple points. First of all, they did twist Orban's arm. They coerced him into accepting this deal. And he really had no choice because Hungary is a small country and they could cause Hungary great economic harm if he didn't go along with the deal. So he went along with the deal. But that brings us to the question of what does this mean for Ukraine? First of all, it's $50 billion, $54 billion over 4 years. But more importantly, that money is not for military equipment. That money is basically money that's designed to keep the government in Kyiv afloat. So it's not like we're giving them money to buy weapons. And even if we did give them money to buy weapons, there are not many weapons to buy. As you and I have talked about on numerous occasions, the problem is that the West doesn't have an industrial base that can spin off large numbers of weapons that it can give to the Ukrainians so that it can stymie these Russian attacks. This is the real problem here. So in the end, this money is not going to have much impact on what happens on the battlefield. And this war will continue to go in Russia's favor as a consequence, because it is a war of attrition. The Russians have a significant manpower advantage, and they have a huge and growing advantage in terms of weaponry.
Did the EU actually threaten to wreck the Hungarian economy and cause innocents to suffer because the president is standing on a sound principle that the Ukraine's going to lose anyway? Why should we waste our money there?
Sure. This is the way the United States operates all the time when countries balk at doing what we want them to do. This is why we have sanctions on so many countries around.
Was the U.S. involved in this EU threat to Orban?
No, I think the United States was surely on the sidelines. I mean, Orban knows that the Americans dislike him as much as most of the countries in the EU dislike him. But the fact is that Hungarian is in a precarious economic situation, in good part because of this war, and therefore it is vulnerable to economic coercion. And the EU is desperate enough to get that money to Ukraine that it was willing to play hardball with him, and they played hardball.
So this, because it's cash and not military equipment, this is a field day for the corruption masters in Kyiv.
Well, this is one of the two reasons that Orban did not want to give the money to Ukraine. He said this is the most corrupt country, or one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and giving them a huge chunk of money like this is like throwing money down a rat hole. And then the second reason that he didn't want to give money to Ukraine is that he thought that this was a lost cause. And the whole idea that you're going to use Ukraine to bleed the Russians white makes no sense at all. And in that regard, I think he was absolutely right. And of course, he was absolutely right on the first point as well.
Right.
Ukraine is a country.
Right. And do you know if, contrary to American cash aid, there is an inspector general for the EU to certify where the cash goes, or does the zeros just show up in the government's account in a Kyiv bank and they can draw down against it as they see fit?
My understanding is they have very limited capability to assess what Ukraine does with the money. There's no evidence that there's a serious mechanism in place for the EU to check exactly where that money goes. So I think a lot of it will be siphoned off.
What is happening to General Zaluzhny, whom you and others have said has been fairly well respected in the international military community? Is President Zelensky's threat to fire him serious? Is he on his way out? And if so, do you know why?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, he is very popular inside of Ukraine. He's very popular in the military, but also in the broader population. His population ratings are over 80%. They're significantly higher than Zelensky's. And Zelensky doesn't have bad poll ratings. I mean, he's not in the class of Joe Biden. He has quite good poll ratings, but Zelensky has much better poll ratings. So you want to understand that when Zelensky goes after Zelensky and says he wants to fire him, this is a really tricky matter. Now, what's the basis of the disagreement? According to news reports, there's sort of two big issues. Aside from the fact that they personally don't like each other, it's just very important to understand that. They just don't get along constitutionally. But there are two big issues. One is that Zelensky, the general, wants to pull Ukrainian troops out of Avdiivka, which is where the biggest battle on the front is now taking place. And Zelensky believes that the Russians are going to win in Avdiivka, and it makes sense to pull out now. Zelensky does not want to pull out. This is a lot like Bakhmut, where last year, as you remember, Zelensky insisted that the Ukrainians stand and fight in Bakhmut. That's what he's talking about doing again, and Zelensky disagrees with him. So that's one fight. The other fight has to do with the mobilization of manpower. As we all know, the Ukrainians are desperate to raise more troops. And Zelensky, unsurprisingly for the commanding military officer, thinks they need 500,000 or approximately 500,000 new troops. Zelensky, who's a political leader, believes that this is politically untenable. If he tries to raise 500,000 troops, there's going to be huge resistance. So Zelensky's talking about smaller numbers, in the range of 300,000, maybe 200,000 new troops. And Zelensky's saying that's not enough. So you have a big dispute between the two of them on this mobilization issue and on the whole question of whether to withdraw troops or not from Avdiivka. And this has led Zelensky to try to fire Zelensky. And he's been unsuccessful so far. And the final dimension I would add to this that shows you what a total mess it is that if he fires Zelensky, he could probably get away with it if he had a popular replacement. In other words, if there was a general in the wings that he could call on to replace Zelensky. But the two possible candidates have both made it clear that they don't want the job. I think they can read the writing on the wall. So if he gets rid of Zelensky, I don't know who he's going to put in his place. But I think whoever is put in that position is not going to help Zelensky very much. All of this is to say Zelensky is in deep trouble.
Do you know, Professor Mearsheimer, if under Ukrainian law he can unilaterally fire him, or does he need the approval of some legislative or administrative body?
I think, I underline the word think, that he can unilaterally fire him. It's like the situation with Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur. You remember that MacArthur was summarily dismissed by Truman.
Right.
I mean, Zelensky is the commander in chief. And this is why he can say, we're going to keep the troops in eastern Ukraine. We're not going to withdraw any troops from Avdiivka.
So if I asked you before the 54 billion was promised by the EU, and now I ask you after the 54 billion promised by the EU, the same question: is Ukraine on its last legs?
There's no question that it is on its last legs. I mean, in terms of the number of troops the Russians have mobilized compared to what the Ukrainians have been able to mobilize to replace losses on both sides, the Russians have a decisive advantage. The Ukrainians have lost huge numbers of troops, and they're unable to mobilize a significant number of people to replace them. And on the other side, the Russians have lost less troops than the Ukrainians, and they have been able to mobilize many more people. And if you look at the balance of weaponry, you have a huge gap between the two sides. And if anything, it's just growing more and more in favor of the Russians. And you know, this is not talked about very much, but the other thing is that it is the Russians who control the skies. I mean, leaving drones aside in terms of, you know, fighter aircraft, bombers, and so forth and so on. The Russian Air Force is wandering all over Ukraine, dropping bombs and launching missiles at infrastructure, lines of communication, at troop concentrations. And they're doing this pretty much at will. And the Ukrainians can't do much to stop it. And this is having a significant effect on the ability of the Ukrainian army to reinforce troops up on the front.
Do you believe that Ukraine shot down a plane carrying 65 returning Ukrainian prisoners of war, that it murdered its own people?
Well, murdered implies that they did it on purpose. I'm not in the legal.
All right, well, we'll change the verb to killed their own people.
I think they accidentally killed their own people. Yes, I think they did not know that the plane was filled with Ukrainian prisoners of war, and they shot it down thinking that it was going to be a decisive blow against the Russian Air Force, when in fact it was no such thing. And in fact, they ended up killing a lot of their own people.
Switching gears, was the International Court of Justice ruling against Israel a day of reckoning for Israel?
Yeah, I think it. I was really surprised at how hard-hitting the ruling was, or the order was. I mean, if you read the Western media, it makes it look like Israel received a weak slap on the wrist. It was just no big deal. And in the Western media, attention was taken off the ICJ order almost immediately. But if you read carefully what that order said, it was a black day for Israel. You want to remember that what the court said was that there is plausible evidence that Israel has the intention to commit genocide, and there is plausible evidence that Israel is in the process, in terms of its actions, in committing genocide.